This week we are going to be working with some layouts. And so I think some of you are going to really like this because you're going to be able to position content side by side. And we're going to be looking at something called the box model. And there is a traditional box model, kind of like an old style way of laying out the content. And then there is something newer called Flexbox. And Flexbox is a more responsive model. So you're going to learn both. And you're going to want to go through the readings because I've kind of split them out into traditional and Flexbox. And the Flexbox can be a little bit confusing. So you will notice, I even have a little cheat sheet here for you. But I also have some resources here. And Flexbox Froggy is actually a game that you can play that helps you become familiar with the Flexbox commands. So hopefully between that and the readings, you'll get a feel for Flexbox. I also have the lecture demo. And we just kind of start with the whole concept of boxes. And basically your content, all your content on a page can be kind of viewed as a virtual box. And the box is made up of the content and then the area that's right outside the content is padding. And then you can add borders. And then outside of all of that is your margins. Okay. And the margins are always transparent. Borders, as you know, have color and styles and all of that. And then the padding just takes on whatever color is the background of your content. So if the background of your content is white, that's what the padding is going to look like. It is really helpful to go through interactive examples where you can actually see, so here's the content of the box. And then we've got the padding, which is this gray area between the content and the border. The border is colored green. And then the area right outside the border is your margin. So in these little interactive examples, it's really helpful if you play around with the numbers. So if I change the margin to 100, okay, and I run it, you can see kind of the box jump because now there's 100 pixels between the top of the box and the content above it, 100 on each side and 100 on the bottom. Okay, I can change it to 10 and run it. Okay, and you can see kind of how that margin affects the layout and positioning of the box. Now, if I change the padding, this is going to change that gray area. Okay, so right now it's 50, which is quite a bit of area between the content and the edge, but I'm going to change it to 10. Okay, and if I do it 0, you'll be able to see why people like padding. Because at 0, the content is just right up against the edge and it looks terrible. And that is why people add padding. And then the border is pretty easy to see. So that's just your colored edge around the outside. So that's basically a virtual box. The way that you would align those within a page really depends on what kind of element you're using. We have structure elements, and those are typically block styles. So they kind of lay one on top of each other. And then you've got content elements, and content elements are side by side. So they're all like next to each other in a paragraph kind of thing. Display property allows you to change that default layout. So instead of having things stacked, you can have them go side by side. that is what the display property does. And so you can change it to several different values. Again, super helpful if you come in here and you kind of check this out. So here's, 3 links that they've got displayed in line. But what if I change it to block? This will show you the difference. Okay, so inline block, of course, none. They're going to disappear. Poof. And then I think inline flex. Let me see if that was another one, or if it's flex. Inline dash flex. That inline flex is mobile friendly. So it's going to look side by side, but if you're on a mobile device, it's a little bit more flexible, user-friendly than just a regular inline. And then inline block, it's kind of the same as a regular block. A list item is going to display with bullets next to it. Display flex is how you set up a flex box. Okay, so display flex is actually what we would use for a flex box. The whole concept of a containing block would be, these would be your elements that have other elements inside. So it's a parent element or a container. So you can see section here has section and paragraph inside. Okay, and so I've actually given it an ID of container, which I can style, and I've given this an ID of box, which I can also style. And then you can kind of see how that works. Now, the key is the container has to be bigger than the box, right? If the box goes inside the container has to be bigger. But here's another example. And if you wanted to see the code, you just right click and view page source. And then we get into our box models. We've got traditional and we've got flexible. Traditional box uses the float property to get the content to lay side by side. Okay, float property is also used with images to get the content to flow around the image. So on the image tag itself, we've got a float right, which is why the image is over on the right. And you can have it float left or float right. And then you might say, why is the text all scrunched up? It's because we don't have padding. So if you look down here on the image, looks like they specified a margin, but no padding. But we could actually put padding up here. Okay, I put padding all the way around, but if I just wanted to put it on the right side, I could do that. Sometimes when you are using floats, it gets confused. Okay, especially if you've changed settings. So what you end up having to do is use clear. And then usually if I'm going to use clear, I just say both. So that just clears out any kind of float setting. And in the exercises that you're going to do the textbook assignment, it does get confused. So you do have to use clear both. So you guys will see how that works. As far as positioning schemes go, these are the different ways that you can position content. And the default is static, which means that elements are positioned by the normal flow of the page, and they're not affected by top, bottom, left, or right. You do need to know what these are. This is something that is on your certification exam. Relative means that the elements are positioned relative to where they normally would be located. So from their normal location, you can move them. Fixed means that the elements are basically going to be positioned relative to the viewport, and they're going to remain in the same location. So even if you scroll, those elements aren't going to move. So sometime, and I'm sure you guys have seen this, where you've got some kind of a background and you scroll over the top of it, that background graphic would be in a fixed position. And if you want to see how these work, you can. So this little div down here says that it's in a fixed position. So I'm going to have to resize this so you guys can actually see, what happens. Let me see if I can really resize. There. Okay, so you can kind of see what happened when I resized it. That little element stayed there. Okay, so that is position fixed. Absolute elements are positioned relative to the nearest parent or ancestor. You'll use absolute positioning to layer content. And with absolute, you give it a top setting, like how far from the top of the screen, and then you give it a left setting, which is how far from the left side, and you can actually stack content on top of each other. Sticky elements are positioned based on the user's scroll position. The best way to understand that is to look at something like this. So if we scroll inside this frame, you'll notice that once we get to a certain position, it just sticks. Okay, and so you'll notice its position is sticky. We've got the top set to 0, but we've got padding at 5. Okay, and that is why it's down a little bit. But then once we start scrolling, it goes right up to 0. Okay, so these are going to be something that we are going to use. We are specifically going to use absolute and relative. We've already used fixed, I believe, when we get into the parallax effect, where we kind of scrolled over the background. So we've already used quite a few of these. Oh, and of course the default is static. So if you don't set a position value, that is what it's going to do. The top, left, bottom, and right properties go with any kind of position that you set. So when you set absolute positioning, you do need to tell it where you want the object or the box positioned, and really you only need to give it top and left. Okay, if you give it how far from the top and how far from the left, that's pretty much the only two settings you need to worry about. Same goes with relative. It looks at the current position and you give it a top and a left setting, and it moves the object from its current location. And you're going to get practice using these. And if you want to play a little bit with them, you can. You can see we've got absolute and we've got relative here. And then you'll notice with absolute, they actually use top and right. And so how this is working, how they've got this set up, is the outer box is the parent and the inner box is the child, and the inner box can only move inside its parent. So when they've got it positioned to the right, it's on the right edge of the parent. Okay, but I can actually change this to left and it should move to the other side. Now it's on the left edge of the parent. Okay, and I could change it to 20 and it's going to, should move. Yeah, well, maybe it's not because sometimes it doesn't always work the way it's supposed to in here. Now let's see, relative, we've got the width and the height. We should be able to position this too. We'll see if we can. Yep, and that is working. And absolute, again, let's see, we've got top and right. So if we wanted to move it, see if that works. Oh, that's interesting. So you guys can kind of see if you play around with it, you can get it to move, you can get things to stack on top of each other. We will be playing around with absolute positioning, so you'll get kind of a feel for how that works. I should say what is kind of cool about it though, is if you put in a background color, and let's say we do green, and then we say opacity, that'll make it kind of transparent. And so then you can actually see the content that's under it if you have it stacked on top of each other. And opacity settings can be between 0 and 1. So I have lots of examples in here about positioning and the settings that I used for those. And quite often, if you use float, you end up having to set a margin. So you'll notice that I specified float, so that would allow the content to come up next to the other, but then I also had to put on a margin to shift it over. Here's an absolute positioning example where the content is specifically laid out where I wanted it to display. So you can see I've got top and left, again, top and left settings. And that's pretty much what I use because you don't really have to use any more than that. That giving it those two coordinates can position the content. Stacking order is actually kind of important because it affects the, what comes on top of the other. And the way things are rendered is the order of your code determines the stacking order. So as it goes through and it reads your code, that is how it figures out what should be on the bottom and what should be on the top. So here the red box is rendered first, should be on the bottom, and the green box should be on top of it. So if we look at the code, here we've got the red is specified before the green. So it should be on the bottom, should be rendered first, but I changed the order by using a z-index. So the z-index lets you specify what box comes on top. Okay, so I did a z-index of 10 for the red, and then the green one I just set to a number below 10. I set it to 1. That forces the red box on top of the green one. So let me see if I can find that other example. I might have closed it. Yeah, we can probably copy this. I wanted to show you just really quick. All right, so there's my little example. Let me take the z-index out. So without the z-index, this is how it would render. Okay, you see that? The red is on the bottom. With the z-index, I can totally change that order. And then here we'll do here. And it should flip. Unless I made a typo, which is possible. Here, I'll just paste it again. There you go. Okay, so z-index changes the order. Then we get into flexible box model. So this is complicated, but there's really only a couple CSS properties that are actually required to create a flex box. So you have to specify what your container is. And you're either going to say display flex or display inline flex. And that just depends on what direction you want the boxes to go. Okay, that's required. And then the other thing that's required is in the child, you need flex:1. So that is all that is required. Everything else deals with customizing the flex box. And this WebKit stuff you do not need anymore. Okay, so we've got a container, display flex. We have the item. This is going to be our child, right? And there's a lot of different ways you can set up Flexbox. And that is what makes it hard to learn. Okay, so you can kind of see that now it is a Flexbox. And what Flexbox does is it should adjust the widths, but we have some absolute widths here specified. So I think I'm going to say the max width and the max height. That gives it permission to adjust the size of the boxes as it needs to. And I don't think I'm going to constrain this. And let's see. Okay, so you can kind of see how they're changing. That is normally what Flexbox does. Let me do a max, or let's see. Let's change that. I'm going to bump that number up. So I did set the max to 600, which lets them get fairly big. And then you can see they're changing in size. That is precisely what a flex box does. And all I really had to do was say display flex. And then in the child, I have flex:1. And then I've specified a maximum height and a maximum width. That is the minimum that you need for a flex box. Okay, everything else deals with either customizing the parent or customizing the child. Okay, you can change the direction. You can have things wrap. Okay, so there's just lots and lots of options that you can read through. And whenever you guys see an interactive link, you definitely should go in and play with it because that will help you learn Flexbox. So after you have gone through the lecture demo, then you are going to work on the textbook assignment. And with the textbook assignment, you're going to download a couple different files, and you should have a lesson 6 folder. Inside your lesson 6 folder, you should have a media folder, and you're going to download some files to that. Also inside your lesson 6, you should have a CSS folder, and you're going to download a CSS file to that. And we're going to be opening up the farm file. And then once you've got that file open, you are going to format it as a traditional box. And so you can see it is telling you what code to enter, and then it kind of shows you how it should look. And this is the problem I described earlier. When you use float, it sometimes gets confused. So you do have to add the clear both into the CSS. Once you're done with that, you're going to make sure you save it, and then you are going to rename it. You're going to make a copy of it, basically, and you're going to call the copy Farm Flexbox. And then you're going to convert the traditional box into a Flexbox. And as I had mentioned before, the parent has to be display Flex, the child has to be Flex 1. Okay, that is the minimum thing you need to do. The clear float you don't need anymore. And then you'll notice that we did add a max and min width to the child. And then for the parent, we did specify that we want it to wrap. Okay, so that that little bit of code changes it from traditional to Flexbox. Then we get into working with absolute positioning. Okay, so we've got some dimensions for our virtual boxes. And then you'll notice that we have a lot of positioning going on. And in this case, what we're positioning are the graphics. Okay, so you'll walk through this, and then it should look like this when you're done. And you can see all the code here that was used. Then we get into using Flexbox attributes and something called CSS Combinators and CSS box enhancements. There's information on the combinators in the web-based readings, and there's also information in the lecture demo. But basically, anytime you have multiple elements like this or like this, you're using a combinator. And so it'll do different things depending on what combinator you use. But this just means that all sections within the article should be changed. And this one, with the little angle bracket, means that all direct children of article that are sections should be modified. So I know that that's kind of like, what the heck does that mean? So if you have an article and you have section, and then maybe you've got div, you've got another section. So the one that's a direct child is this one. Okay, this section down here is not a direct child. That would be like a great-grandchild, right? This is the child, the grandchild, this is the great-grandchild. So only the one that is the child, the level below it, is the one that would be affected if you use that combinator. So you're going to walk through here using combinators. You're going to also be using Flexbox with some of the different Flexbox attributes. And then once you're done, make sure that you've transferred all of this to the web. And this is how the points are going to break down on the assignment. For the lab, you're going to be creating your own page. And you need a traditional box and you need a flex box. And you can use the exact same code or the same concept or idea for both of the boxes. So for the traditional box, this is kind of like a skeleton of, how you would be creating your HTML. And I do have an example. So this is a traditional box. And you will notice if I adjust the size here, the boxes adjust, right? Okay, so this is traditional box. And you'll notice for my flex box, I kept the same content. But immediately you're going to see, oh, wow, that looks different, right? Well, it looks different because it's Flexbox. So as I adjust the size, you're going to notice that the sizes of the box are going to adjust. And they're basically using the minimum and maximum widths that I sent. So it can't be smaller than the minimum. It can't be bigger than the maximum. So that's what it's using to determine, how to size these boxes. So this is traditional, this is Flexbox. Same content, two different CSS layouts. So for each one of them, I did include the CSS so you can take a look at it. Okay, and you can do something similar. You can pick the same concept for your page and do one that's traditional and one that is Flexbox. So if you do this, after you get the traditional one done, you are going to need to copy this and save it as Flexbox. And you're going to need to copy this and save it as Flexbox. And then it's super important that you remember in your HTML to go in and change the link so that it's looking at the Flexbox and not the traditional box CSS. Okay, so here is kind of what you need to do to get this into a Flexbox. And that is the assignment. So you're going to add the links into your assignment page. And then you will transfer it to the web. And again, the only problem that people have had with this is they have forgotten in their Flexbox page when they create their Flexbox model CSS, they forgot to put it in here. So it still said traditional box. Okay, so make sure that you make that change, and then I don't think you guys are going to have any problems with this particular assignment. Again, if the Flexbox is a little confusing, I think that is kind of normal. So that is why I gave you all of these resources. Okay, and I do think that they will help you get a better feel for Flexbox. Although going through the assignment should also give you a better feel. Reach out if you've got any questions at all, and I hope you have a great week. And I am looking forward to seeing what you guys create.